Bam.
This is Saul Kassin, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
I love doing this. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, 1,500 episodes, and you get to study a lot of things through people who are experts in their field. So I watch a lot of documentaries. I have a lot of filmmakers on. We see all these things from the criminal justice system that give us pause. Where police are doing things that you're like, gosh, I wouldn't want that to happen to me. That's probably the best way to say it. And one of the things that I saw you were talking about these false confessions. And we really struggle with this as a society. Like, why would someone admit to doing something, especially something as horrible as some of these confessions are? And this is, you have to do it. And this is your field of expertise. So I thought we might just open with just an overall, I guess, the psychology of these false confessions. I mean, where do we start? Let me ask you, where do we start?
Oh my God. What 40 years ago when I started, I didn't believe it. Like everybody said, no, I would never confess. You'd have to put a gun to my head for me to confess to something I didn't do. And that became my anchor point for evaluating others. So it doesn't happen unless under extreme circumstances. That was my. Well, then I had some education and I did some reading and I took a law course and I started collecting data. And, a few things happened all at once. And now when I say all at once, I'm taking us back to, like, I hate to age myself, but I'm taking myself back to 1978. I started to do research on jury decision-making, and I happened to notice that every time there was a confession in evidence, everybody voted guilty. I had to remove those trials as those stimulus trials for research purposes because everybody voted the same way. And then I got interested because I took a class at a law school at the University of Kansas. And I took a course on evidence because I figured if I'm going to study juries, I should know something about the rules of evidence. And the case book I was reading had a chapter on confession evidence and a footnote to a manual on how to interrogate people to produce confessions. Now, I'd never seen this manual. It turned out to be the first edition of what is the most commonly used Bible in the field. And so I pulled out, we're talking about libraries now where you physically walk in and take out a loan. And I went in and I took out the book and I read it and I was shocked. I'm trained in social psychology, and social psychologists study how situations can overwhelm people to do things they would otherwise never do. I looked at that book and I read it cover to cover. And I was shocked. I thought, oh my God, if they ever get innocent people into this situation, I can understand now how innocent people would confess. So my next step was to go back over the pages of history. And the oddest first case came my way. There was a guy named Peter Riley. I had gotten my Ph.D. at the University of Connecticut in 1978. There was a guy named Peter Riley about an hour from Storrs, Connecticut, where the university is. And in 1973, he came home one day and found his mother in a pool of blood, having been slashed. She was dead. He called 911. And after hours of interrogation and denials on his part of having anything to do with it, there was no good reason why he was considered a suspect. He had no history of violence, no criminal justice background, no conflict with his mother. Everybody who knew him said he would never do such a thing. But the police sergeant got it in his head that Riley was their guy, and without further investigating, interrogated him. Riley couldn't stop them. And so they said, well, are you willing to take a lie detector test, a polygraph? And he said, absolutely. He did what innocent people do. He showed no consciousness of guilt. And they administered the test. And long story short, they told him, they lied to him and said, you failed the test. And it blew him away. And they told him, it's infallible. This machine tells us things about you and the things you've done that even you may not be aware of. And I read 2 books about his case that had just come out that year. And in the text was just mind-numbing. He's adamantly denying anything to do with it for hours. Not just, I didn't do it. I wouldn't do such a thing. And I can't even imagine. He's 18 years old. He's in a state of God knows what trauma. He sees his mother like that. And it's his only surviving relative.
Oh,
And now the interrogation takes this turn where they're convincing him that he failed a polygraph, and he doesn't know what to do with it. And then, as according to the books, the transcript of his interrogation takes this turn. At one point, he finally puts his head down and says, "This machine is starting to give me doubts." And then, few moments later, maybe an hour or so later, he says, "Well, it looks like I did this." And then a couple hours after that, he says, I pulled out the razor that I use in my model airplane and I slashed my mother's throat. And then I kicked her and did this and that and the other thing." That was Riley's confession. For it, which he recanted later, but for it, he was convicted and sentenced, spent about a year and a half in prison until he was exonerated. A new DA came into the office and said, "Oh my God, there's exculpatory information in here that was never disclosed." He couldn't have done it. And so he was released, and that was the end of his story, at least for that part.
right. Yeah.
And so here was a case. I looked at it. Now, he not only confessed, they confused him and disoriented him. He didn't know up from down anymore.
Yeah.
And that's because they lied to him, and he was a kid and he was vulnerable, particularly at that moment. And I read that, and then I went back to the manual and I went back to my jury data, and I thought, oh my God, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
So those are, I started like everybody else thinking should not be an issue. After a couple of years, and then to be honest, 40 years later, it's like peeling the layers of an onion. It's getting worse. The things I discover get worse and worse, not just about why innocent people confess, but the fact that once they do, nothing else matters.
Yeah. That's so some of the crazy things are, as you're telling me the story, and I completely believe you because you're a professional and we know these things happen, but there's these triggers in me that I'm like, no, he killed her. Like you still
Yeah.
you still, it's hard to believe, it's hard to accept that someone would say that and do it. And then I think about, and I want to say this in a very fair way, I think about police people who are desperate to solve these crimes. And look, I don't know about the case in this one here, but oftentimes they're just not qualified to take on a case this complex,
Yeah.
because a lot of what they do is not that. Like in my hometown, there are murders on occasion and it's big news, right? But not often enough that you're like, I'm a crack detective, like, oh, every now and then I get to do that. Mostly I chase kids and try to, figure out who's breaking windows on cars and, you're doing other things, right? And all of a sudden you get this thing dropped in your lap. And of course, you're going to start right in the house. The one living person connected to this lady is her son. And that's the person most likely to kill you. So sure, you start right on that road. And why wouldn't you look? I was a counterintelligence agent when I was in the Army. We do interrogations.
Mhm.
And if you latch on to something, you're going to chase it down and you're going to try to mentally break that person.
Yes. 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 And what's interesting is, and this is the problem with that case and with so many of them that I see, they latched onto him right away based on a hunch, only based on a hunch. Had
Hunch, right.
they done just a little bit of investigation, they would have noticed that the two guys who lived next door, who had a history of violence and who had gotten into arguments with Riley and his mother, might have been suspects. And to this day, I actually continue to speak with, I got in touch with Peter Riley years later, and we talk now. And what frustrates him is he's been exonerated, but police will not reopen the investigation. They will not admit his innocence, and he wants those people brought to justice. Whoever they are, he wants them brought to justice. And this brings me to, people think when I study false confessions that that I'm solely and exclusively interested in the tragedy, the human tragedy of taking an innocent person and incarcerating them, and believe me, the tragic stories to them, their families, their loved ones, their friends. Believe me, that's enough of a motivation. But
Sure.
something else happens when you close a case on an innocent person. The offender remains free and out and about, locked and loaded, and ready to reoffend. And guess what? The data show that they do reoffend.
Right.
So it's not in the interest of public safety to close a case quickly like that.
Yeah, boy, it gets your blood going so quickly when you realize that this happens a lot. I don't think it's most murders go unsolved, but the number of unsolved murders, it's shocking. Because there's, especially if it's in a place, the opposite is true now. Instead of the last example, like my hometown, if there are a lot of violent crimes, you're just not going to solve all of them. There's just not enough capacity, and the case almost has to go cold, and then be notable enough that a cold case team will take it on, and they're usually civilians who are retired cops,
Right.
and it's almost always the case that they had that hunch and latched onto it, and then the person who did it is not obvious, but available. They can find that person. What does the science say on hunches? I mean,
Uh,
are hunches a real thing?
well, having a hunch is a real thing. Um, there are training courses that train investigators and future investigators to learn how to become human lie detectors and to know when someone is lying or telling the truth,
Right.
and do it by providing them some sample questions. And then you stop and you observe your interviewee's behavior. You look for signs of deception, such as he breaks eye contact, he looks away, he shifts his posture, he no longer is frontal with me, he starts fidgeting. I will say it doesn't take a whole lot of sentencing here. The research, and this involves hundreds of studies in labs conducted all over the world for God knows how many, 50, 60 years, those cues do not indicate deception. Those cues may indicate somebody in a state of stress, but if you're in a police station and they're accusing you of a murder, you're stressed. It doesn't mean, and you may show signs of stress. It doesn't mean you're being deceptive. It just means you're stressed. So the first problem is we all have hunches. We form hunches, and to make matter, and so just as a kind of a foundation, because I don't out of the gate blame police for these mistakes
Sure.
because they're human, and
Yep.
human beings form expectations. They form hunches, and then those hunches kind of narrow the lens. Now they only see what they expect to see, and inconsistent information sometimes gets bypassed. And so part of that is just natural and human. But on top of that, you layer these training courses that lead investigators to believe they can tell with certainty whether someone is lying or telling the truth. And these courses are saying we can make you 85 to 90% accurate as a human lie detector. That's just not true. And the
That's not
data
true.
show it's not true. And what it does is it inflates an investigator's level of confidence in their first impression. That's problematic.
Oh, let me tell you, one of the things I learned is how error riddled my technique was, and so I am looking for deception. I'm also looking for positive things, but I'm looking for clues on which lever to pull to get what I want from the person that I'm talking to. And I realized I will never be able to comprehend how many mistakes I'm making in my judgment. And I have to always flip the camera around and see things from their perspective. Like if they're freaked out, they're no good to me, right? I
Right.
need to calm them down. And even if time is of the essence, what's more important than that is accuracy, right? And so, like, hey, you're too freaked out. Let's calm down and let's spend the whole time just calming you down. And then if I get one thing right, that's way more valuable than going fast and just having no idea and just creating chaos in this relationship, even if it's a
Right.
temporary one-time thing, or if it's going to be a multi-week, multi-month relationship where I'm trying to establish trust. But that took me understanding just how bad I was at that hunch thing. Like, okay, I read body language. Yeah, there's clues, right? Like this person's excited. They got their hands above their heart. Okay, that's relatively accurate, but I'm not going to say, and that makes them the murderer. Like you can't make these leaps. Body language is not, gosh, I don't want to tell you, you're the expert on these kind of things, but body language is not as accurate as we want it to be.
So when you see a suspect freak out, you wouldn't necessarily presume guilt from that freak out? You understood the situation they were in, and
I would want to test it, right? And I'm dealing with people that maybe are murderers, or maybe they're just knowledgeable about things that I need them to be knowledgeable about. But I would back up and be like, let me test my hypothesis. Let me
yes,
ask other questions. Let me come in a different angle, you know. And I'd work with my interpreter to try to figure out like, what have I missed? Because I know that I'm going to miss things. It's cross language, it's cross cultural, it's cross. All these things make it very muddy, and
yes.
so it behooves me to slow down, try a different approach. Because if this is the truth, if A is the truth, let me come in from this alternate oblique and see if A is still the truth.
So it sounds like you're constantly fact checking yourself,
I have to.
and
Yeah, I
not
have to.
not narrowing down right out of the gate.
Right.
I've lost track of the number of investigators trained in these techniques that have said to me, uh, and in response to, "Aren't you concerned that you might be getting innocent people to confess using highly deceptive techniques?"
Yeah.
And the answer I get over and over again is, "Oh, we don't interrogate innocent people." They are they are so certain in that initial judgment they make that there's no turning back. And
Yeah.
once I understood that first impression sets it in motion, and there's no turning back, I started to understand. Gee, we don't interrogate innocent people. No wonder you're so relentless. No wonder sometimes I count a suspect issuing adamant denials over 100 times, and each time you still call him a liar. What does this
Right.
person have to do to get out of this situation? Anything at all? Because the interrogator seems beyond persuasion, and they've locked in, and that's the start of a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, isn't it ever. The, then you think about, gosh, how often do we get it right? I mean, okay, there are times when it's clearly like this person did it and there's a confession and it all makes sense. Okay, well, that exists. But much of the time, there's just the two people in the incident. And oh my God, how many, is there a percentage on what you think the accuracy of confessions is?
There's no percentage. We know that the numbers of false confessions are just astonishingly high when the Innocence Project started using DNA to
Ah,
dispute.
yeah, yeah.
Nobody saw coming that 30% of their cases would involve false confessions. Believe
Yeah.
me, when I first got interested in the 1970s, the phrase that kept coming at me is, "Oh, interesting, but that happens like maybe what, once in a blue moon?" Well,
Right.
no, it happens a lot, and it happens so much that the numbers that we can account for doesn't account for they don't that doesn't take into account cases in which the perpetrator is found after an innocent person confessed, or the fact that the crime turns out was never committed. It's interesting. Most people don't know this. The first ever known wrongful conviction in the United States was in 1819 in Manchester, Vermont. Two guys were two guys were accused of killing their sister's husband, who they didn't like because the husband
Mm.
disappeared. And they both confessed, and one ended up on death row and was scheduled to be executed until, guess what? The lost husband showed up alive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you know,
Talk about exoneration.
exactly. Talk about exoneration. And then there are God knows how many cases. Today the guilty plea rate is up around 97 or 98% of cases in the US today are solved by a guilty plea. Well,
Mm.
if you've confessed to police, you are way more likely to have to take a guilty plea later, whether you're innocent or not, because your lawyer comes and said, "You made this confession, you signed this, or you gave that recording, you're going to get convicted at trial." And the lawyer is not wrong. And
Mm.
so the confession to police becomes a trap that produces a guilty plea. And the guilty plea, quote unquote, corroborates the confession. So we don't know how many of those cases that never get scrutinized because they concluded in a guilty plea, where often there is an appeal of waiver attached to the plea agreement. So it's hard to know. I've worked on cases in which a confession was taken and then ultimately they realized the DA's office realized that the crime was not committed and dropped the charges. The case went away quietly. There was a confidentiality agreement. They settled something financial. So I don't know how many of those. And then, and this may actually help, there are cases, and because of your military background, right? The criminal justice system is one venue where you get the possibility of a false confession, but the military is another venue where you get the possibility of a false confession. I grew up watching, TV videos of American prisoners of war confessing to war crimes they never committed because they were propped on and coerced to do so. And so we have that history. We know that. But for your listeners, let me try this as a thought experiment, because I understand the reluctance to believe that this could actually happen to you.
Right.
Imagine you're working for an auto parts manufacturer, and you're working in their retail outfit, and all of a sudden money shows up missing in the system. And the manager, your supervisor, pulls you in during the workday, closes the door, makes sure you don't have any recording equipment, and says, $830 has turned up missing from the system. And based on when it was lost and the information we have, it seems that it's traceable to you. That happened on your shift, on your watch. We believe you stole that money. You say, no, I didn't do it, because you didn't do it. And after 2 or 3 hours, and mind you, the claim is you're not in custody, but you're in the middle of a workday. You can't just get up in front of your supervisor and walk out and keep your job. So you're in a custodial situation for all practical purposes. And then after a while, the loss prevention manager says to you, your supervisor, you know what? Look, we can just solve this the easy way. I can just call the police. They'll come down and this will become a police matter. Or you can agree to sign an admission of guilt, agree to pay back the money from future installments of your paycheck, and we'll be done. Well, think about that decision. We can involve police, or for $830, you keep your job, you pay back that money, and we don't involve the police, and your family doesn't have to deal with all of that. It's not an irrational decision for an innocent
bargain.
It's a bargain. And so I'm describing a thought experiment that people say, oh, God, yeah. In fact, I know a lot of people talk to me after talks and say, oh, God, I did that. I confessed to stealing money at work and I didn't steal it. That case I just described to you is a real case. And the guy by the name of Joaquin Robles at AutoZone in San Diego for $830 agreed to sign a confession. The confession he signed was, look, I took the money. I don't have a gambling habit. I don't have a drug habit, but we had family debt. I'm so sorry. I won't do it again. Here's my signature. And then he signed a promissory note in which he agreed to pay it back out of future paychecks. And he thought he was done. He was promptly fired once they took back the money. And then a few weeks later, it turns out there was a clerical error. No money was missing. No money was stolen. But there he was. He lost his job. His reputation was tarnished. He did what a rational decision maker would do. He cut his losses.
Right.
And it was a rational decision. So, there's a false confession that I think the average person can understand.
Yeah, and it's terrifying because you're right. Like it's like this is solved for $1,000. Great. Let's just knock it out. You know what? Because you can do the math. Having the police come in and turn my life upside down, and now we're talking a murder or some kind of violent crime. And I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my house. All these things are definitely in play now, even if you've done nothing wrong. Yeah. But you risk all of that exposure, sitting in front of a jury and trying to convince them you didn't do something. Where if you don't show emotion, you're heartless. If you show emotion and you're like, oh, it's too much, right? Like you can't win. I did this whole series, Saul, on I called it the Prison Chronicles. And I took a bunch of murderers who had been rehabilitated, and we talked about all these things. And they're like, yeah, you're just caught. You're trapped in this system. And one of the guys said something really interesting. He said, I didn't meet any murderers. I met people that had killed people, but these weren't hardened murderers. These are people that had made a mistake, and largely because their life was chaotic, right?
Yeah.
And I'm paraphrasing what he said. And if you took that out, you took that chaos out, and if they had help where they needed it and mentorship, and they've got to be able to accept that. And that's one of the problems. These guys wouldn't be in that situation. And so that makes you think even worse, like, oh my gosh, we're putting innocent people in jail. We've got people that are recoverable if we can just wrap our arms around them and like case manage them out. But instead, I don't know, what are there a 250,000 people in prison in the United States? Is that number bigger? And so that means there's 70,000 people or more that are currently in prison on false if they're in confessions. There's a lot of people in jail. And then how many workaday people are like, yeah, I didn't do this thing, but if I can make this problem go away for $1,000 and just take the hit and keep going, God, there's got to be millions of those people.
Oh, I can't even. And the way I know I worked on that case, the one I just described.
Yeah.
Now, normally I don't do a lot of casework. I restrict it to 1 or 2 a year, in cases that intrigue me because it's something I hadn't seen. When I got the phone call about this case, I thought, oh, false confession in a workplace venue. That's interesting. I got to read the training manual that they use to bring people in, the workers in. When I was done, I was stunned by what I had seen because it seemed so rational. It seemed so obvious.
Right.
When I give talks in public, I've had, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 people come up to me afterwards.
Yeah.
Sometimes tearfully to tell me, and embarrassed to say, but I did that. A graduate student in Europe came up to me after a talk and said, I had a job, money was stolen. I signed a confession. I thought it would be over, and it ruined my life.
Right.
People come up to me to talk. So I don't know. And when I worked on that case that I talked about, he was awarded $7 million. I testified in that case. He was awarded $7 million. That award was scaled down a bit, but
yeah.
After the award and after the verdict was reported, my phone rang off the hook from other ex-employees of that same company, and then from other companies. This is not an infrequent thing. I can't attach a number to it, but again, the mental calculus tells you, well, yeah, of course, I might do the same thing.
So I had a friend also in the Army. He was a lawyer, and he had a knack for taking cases that came to him. And in this case, he's acting within a unit, not as a lawyer, but he's also a lawyer in the reserve, in the regular life, right? And there were a lot of sexual abuse claims, and so he would take time to explain to the person, the accuser, like, hey, here's what's going to happen. If this happened, we're going to go after these guys. They're going to be out of the Army, and we're going to ruin their lives if we can. Like, we're really going to come after them. But understand that if they didn't do that, we're going to come after them. We're going to ruin their lives. We're going to kick them out of the Army. And he said a large percentage of the time, the person would back out, and what had happened to them. And it's a different dynamic, but same thing.
Yeah.
A girl is attractive for the first time in her life to some guys, and look, I'm not justifying bad behavior. I'm just explaining these scenarios, and they put themselves into a sexual situation. They're young. The other people are young. Maybe there's drinking going on, and they go farther than maybe than they would normally have done. And then the shame creeps in, and then the friend advises, and then they get talked into accusation as opposed to confession. And you have these horrible circumstances where there's lives in the balance, and you think about that part too, where this, because of shame and because of some kind of inculcation, someone will levy this false charge. And then you're stuck. You're on this conveyor belt. You're just like, we're going to court, and people's lives are going to be ruined because of this.
Right.
It's crazy.
It's and that actually brings up a bigger point, which is in so many false confession cases, the starting point for the false confession is that, and this goes to the law, and this goes to training in the U.S., which is that police are permitted by law to lie about evidence. And that lie, whether it comes from an accuser making a false accusation or from a detective manufacturing evidence, that throws people. Almost almost every false confession I've seen involved a precipitating lie about evidence. And these are not small lies, and they're
Yeah.
not solo lies, and they're not lies restricted to adults, but sometimes to kids. Um,
Mm.
we have your DNA on the murder weapon. Michael Crow was 14 years old when his 12-year-old sister Stephanie was killed in the middle of the night, and he woke up and the house was chaotic because they had discovered her. And again, police decided that Crow was a suspect because he just didn't seem emotional enough. He didn't seem troubled enough by the events. So
Yeah.
they separated him from parents, brought him in. Within the hours of isolating him from parents, they said, Stephanie's blood was found on your pillow. That was false.
Mm.
But that threw him. How could that have happened? And then they suggested that she had hair in her grasp and it was his.
Oh boy.
Again, that threw him. And then they offered to give him a lie detector test, not a polygraph, but a voice stress analyzer test. And they gave him the feedback that he failed. You can actually Google Michael Crow on camera, on video, breaking down over the quote unquote realization that he killed his own sister.
Mm.
And long story short, so he confesses. He is disoriented beyond belief. He has come to believe. They convinced him, and they brainwashed him. They convinced him not only that he killed her, but that the reason he doesn't remember is that there's a good Michael and a bad Michael. And the
Oh
bad
boy.
got up out of his sleep and killed her while the good Michael stayed asleep and had no consciousness or memory of this. And so he implicated another friend in his confession. They went and got the friend, and the friend confessed.
Oh my God.
Long story
What?
short, Long story short, a drifter in the neighborhood is later found with Stephanie's blood all over him. He had a history of mental illness and violence, and he was later found, and those kids were removed from juvenile detention and released. But I look at that and I think to myself, he's 14. His sister just died. You've separated him from his family. You're lying to him not once, not twice, but 3 times about evidence. And the U.S. courts think that's okay?
Yeah.
They think that doesn't put an innocent kid at risk? I don't think it requires a Ph.D. in psychology to see the problem here.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I wanted to have you on the show, because these things are exasperating. You have this, yeah, you can lie during an interrogation, but that doesn't mean like it's such a bad policy. I mean, yes, there are techniques, and I don't want to talk badly about the police because they're in an impossible situation, but it's infuriating to know that that's going on out there. And the folks who are most badly damaged at that time, this guy's lost his sister. We lose sight of that in a second, or sort it out in court. I'm going to arrest you now. You'll figure it out later. That's a life-changing experience, having to go sit through all that stress, and you just want it to end. I think about that staircase documentary, and whether that guy did it or not, I have no idea. But I know that I wouldn't want that to have happened to me.
Right.
Like how it went down for him. There's another case. It's a murder out in, gosh, I think it was in Fort Leavenworth. That's where the guy's held, at least. And it's a military thing. He was tried and convicted, and then they said, nope, you guys cheated in the trial. We're going to go again. He was exonerated. And then the military court came in and said, we're going to take a crack at it. And they convicted him, and he's still in jail. And one of the things they haven't done, and it blows my mind, is there is DNA under the victim's fingernails, right? They won't test it.
They won't test
They
it.
got their guy. Yeah.
Now, now right out of the gate, I ask, why wouldn't you test it? Is it about money? Is it about money?
Yeah, and that was it. There's no legal requirement, and we don't have money for that. Like it just blows my mind that that's okay.
Yeah. And I mentioned this Michael Crow case in Deception, but it's not just kids. There was a 41-year-old farmer in Illinois named Gary Gauger who discovered his parents killed on their farm, the family farm, and police polygraphed him, and they convinced him he failed the polygraph, and then convinced him that he must have had an alcoholic blackout because he was drinking beer that night. And so he confessed. He spent some time on death row. After several years in prison, he was exonerated when the actual perpetrators were found. But he's a 41-year-old guy, not an inherently vulnerable little kid. But bring him in, he's vulnerable in the sense that he's grieving the death of his parents, and proceed to lie about evidence. And here's the thing: we don't know. Americans don't know that police are allowed to lie about evidence. So when they say they have this unimpeachable evidence against us, we have to assume it to be true. But we don't have a memory. So now what?
Right.
And then they provide an explanation for why we can't remember the thing we did. It's
is there go, please continue.
The law needs to be changed. And just this one last point, because I've heard the defense. I've heard the defense. I've been proposing a ban on deception. I've heard the defense that the sky would fall, that we would never solve crimes, guilty people will run free, blah, 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 blah. Well, here's the thing. In the 1980s, England had a rash of bad false confession cases, and they changed the rules of the game. They reoriented they were using the same techniques we were. They first of all required the recording, at least audio recording, of all sessions. And two, they banned deception. And we now have data over time that show us that they haven't been hurt in their ability to solve crimes. They continue to get confessions. They continue to solve crimes. There's no increase in the crime rate. And they've stopped having false confessions. They don't. There's no reports of those kinds of false confessions anymore. It's not impossible to do it, which is why, I feel safe in saying that a number of law enforcement, I call them progressive, but enlightened law enforcement folks are now training and preaching that you don't need to lie to get to the truth, and you can solve crime with or without confession. It's funny. I've got a friend in England who puts it so nicely. He goes, "You'd be amazed at how much people tell you when you're nice to them."
Yeah. This goes to like what I do. I try to build trust. And it's my job is to build trust. If I build trust with you, because in my field, you're supposed to lie to people and deceive them and dominate the conversation. And I just have found that's not reliable. It's a path towards bad things. What is the psychology of someone who goes through that process and they realize, holy shit, I might have put 150 people in jail because of my hunches and how wrong they were and this technique that I was trained. Is there a psychology there where they're able to turn around and be like, I've got to be better at this. This is more important than what I maybe was allowing for. And let me say one more thing too. One of the things that made me a better spy was I started smashing my ego down. It didn't matter if I was right. It mattered that I got it right.
Oh, that's interesting. When did you realize that? I'm just curious. During your work?
When everything was focused on threat and we were losing every day, and I'm like, everything, it's like Sherlock Holmes thing. Like if everything, you've limited everything, only the impossible remains. And I'm like, is it possible that I'm wrong all the time? And then I'm like, are we as a unit wrong all the time? And so that completely changed my thinking. And so I just started being more open about who I was, what I was doing, why I was there, what my targets were, that kind of thing. And I just started meeting people at a rate that was way better than the other way, where I'm just like banging on my drum, rah, rah, rah. Where are the bombs? Where are the bombs? You're never going to find that stuff like that. And so that's it. It slowly pieced together. I was probably in my early 30s when I realized what it was. I wasn't good at it then, but I got good over time, where I realized how strong it was to approach things this way.
Right.
So yeah, it was a while.
That's fascinating. You remained open to the possibility that you got things wrong. For reasons I don't understand, because I'm not a mind reader. I see too many instances, particularly in the wrongful convictions area, in which the investigators never admit they got it wrong, no matter what. And I mean, when I say no matter what, I mean, you get a 16-year-old kid to confess to killing his mother, stealing her car keys, and sexually assaulting her. And then 2 weeks after you get that confession, you catch somebody driving his deceased mother's car, and
Right.
they're running a red light. You run the plates, you see it's her car, you stop it, you pull him out, you run a check on him, on the driver, and it turns out he has a long history of violence. He's a felon who's out now. And it turns out he had just moved into the deceased mother's home.
Oh my God.
And those detectives did not reset the investigation.
Right.
They went up, they interviewed that guy, they got him to implicate the original confessor in a way that made no sense. And that confessor spent 20 years in prison before being exonerated. And so,
right.
The unwillingness to admit a mistake is the thing I don't understand in these cases the most.
Yeah.
And that applies often to the prosecutors who prosecuted these cases. It's not just the cops, it's a system-wide problem.
Right.
The police hand a confession to a prosecutor who is supposed to vet it and determine if it's credible enough to use as a basis for prosecution. Then it's likely challenged at a suppression hearing where a judge determines no problem, it was voluntary, and the judge isn't really doing their job. And then it goes to the jury, and the jury doesn't stand a chance at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's part of, like, I consider it an important civic responsibility. So I don't talk badly about jury duty and everything, but nobody who's there is happy, And
I've never
my
made
default.
Never know.
My default for juries is like, hey, I'm gonna fall on the side of the innocent. It's going to be really, really hard to convince me because I know all the hocus pocus that's going on. All the cards are stacked against that person sitting in that chair. And to take that bet, to say, I'll sit in front of my peers, there's something significant there. Do I want to let a murderer go free? No. Do I want to put an innocent person behind prison? Even more no. So I would just be open to saying, you guys are really going to have to convince me, like very, very much convince me, because I don't trust it. I don't trust that system to get it right. And it's not that the people are bad. I think it's a human value, like with these hate crime hoaxes, Jesse Smollett and all these kind of people like that. Even when it's proven this did not happen, it's race. It's too emotional, and so they can't let it go. And like, well, it should have happened, or it could have happened, or it does happen. And so this thing that's false becomes true. Like Tawana Brawley and all these names of all these people that have had these things come up and they make national news. There's people that are like, no, that absolutely happened. Right. And so I think it's a human value to not be able to evolve to the point where you can say, well, maybe we should take a look at this. Maybe we do need to look at some other people, Who is the rapist in the neighborhood, Say it again.
You will not survive juries. Now you won't be allowed to serve on a jury. For some reason, I've never been allowed on a jury. I haven't had that opportunity yet.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't be trying to get out of jury duty, but I basically my default is going to be innocent. So that if you're interested in that, great. Maybe that gets me on the jury on the other side of it. But I don't know.
Here's the thing, and juries overwhelmingly convict on the basis of confessions. But here's why you can't blame them. And when I say overwhelmingly convict, there are cases where the DNA evidence excludes the defendant who confessed, and the jury knows it. That evidence is presented before trial, and they know it.
Wow.
Most people don't realize this. Most people think the Central Park jogger guys were DNA exonerated 13 years later. No. That DNA that excluded them was known to the judge and the jury at the time of their trials. And the jurors have been quoted as saying, but there was a confession, so there's nothing else mattered.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for this. A false confession is not just, all right, if you say so, I did it. No, a false confession is a full narrative statement. It's a story, a chronology that says, this is what I did. This is how I did it, when I did it, who I was with, what it looked like, what it sounded like, what the victim said to me, what I said back. And oh, by the way, I'm so sorry, and I'm remorseful, and I wouldn't do this again. That is the sight and sound of a false confession. I think the most incredible statistic in the false confessions literature is that 94% of known false confessions, now these are cases no longer in dispute, their innocence is not in dispute, 94% of those cases contained facts about the crime that were precise, accurate, vivid, and not in the public domain. But those facts were known to police who analyzed the crime scene.
Yeah.
And those facts were communicated through the process of interrogation. And so by the time a jury is listening to a confession, they're hearing a guy saying, so I went into my neighbor's house, I opened her window, I left it about halfway open. I went in, I smoked 3 Marlboro cigarettes. I didn't finish one of them. I left it in the ashtray. I stuffed her mouth full of pills. You'd find her laying horizontal on the bed. I mean, the kind of detail that is mind-numbing and absolutely accurate, and he's being exonerated years later.
Right.
So how do you expect the jury not to convict, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And you want it to be simple, but I know it's not. So attorneys in the defense aren't saying, let's listen to this confession. Hey, look, the police have introduced laying on her stomach at this point in time. The police introduced Marlboro cigarettes at this time. And then later on, the guy says it. That to me would be like, as a guy in the jury, I'd be like, you know what? Nope, not going to do it. You can't introduce the evidence that you're going to convict on, right? Like it's got to be them introducing.
Well, you know what's worse is
no, I don't want to. I don't even want to know what's yes. Tell me what's worse. I'm ready.
I'm sorry. The typical jury, like in the case I just described with those details, they saw the final confession. The camera was not turned on for the process of interrogation that produced that confession. Often all they see is the final product, the Hollywood product, without all the production and scripting that preceded that. So they have no idea. And I've heard mock juries deliberate saying, he says he was coerced, and it does seem like there was a lot of pressure. And he says he's innocent, but then how did he know those things? Yeah. Well, he knows those things because they were communicated to him. And again, just to back up a bit, it doesn't mean that the cops are doing something nefarious. If they believe that the person they're talking to, that the suspect they're questioning, if they believe he's the criminal, they feel free to communicate facts about the crime, not because they're trying to plant them in his head, but because they think he already knows them. And so, there's a DC, retired DC Metro Police detective who had taken a confession in a murder case. He was stunned that the woman who confessed to him was exonerated. In Metro DC police at the time, they were requiring that the full interrogation be recorded. So he went in, pulled that tape off the shelf and watched it, and then wrote about his reaction. He said, I couldn't believe what I saw. Every fact of the final confession came from me. Yeah. And he didn't know it except when he reviewed the tape. Right. And so he's a great guy. He would not have set this person up on purpose. This was not nefarious. It was an innocent mistake. So again, a lot of it just happens because we're people. And we in a funny way, we need to guard against that fact. We need to guard against our humanity.
Do we need to update the Bill of Rights to include automatic representation? Like you can't be interrogated without a lawyer present? Because I mean, I think that would solve a lot of this. Like, hey, my client's not talking. We're just going to go ahead and walk out. Is he under arrest? No, we're leaving. I mean, it's just, I've been talking to the camera. If you guys are ever arrested and they're throwing things, just say, I want a lawyer instantly. And it'll change, hopefully, your outcome if you're innocent.
Now, that never happens, almost never happens. Over the years, ever since Miranda rights were first given to us in 1966, the waiver rate is constantly at or over 80%. 80% of people waive their rights. And research shows if you're innocent, you're even more likely to waive your rights. Right. When I talk to exonerees, I always ask them questions. First, okay, so why did you confess to the thing you didn't do? And then my second question is, when it got ugly, because then they describe all the trickery and deception and coercion. And then I said, well, when it got ugly, why didn't you just ask for a lawyer? They look at me like I've got two heads on my shoulder. And their answer is always pretty much, well, I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't do anything wrong. Right. Innocent people don't understand the peril. Yeah. They think, I can do this. We'll talk. They'll see I didn't do this. They'll investigate their evidence. They'll see I didn't do this. And so they don't exercise their Miranda rights.
Yeah.
Miranda.
Yeah. Wow.
And you're right. And you're right. The problem with Miranda, the first problem with Miranda is it's not automatic. You have to invoke it. That means you have to understand it, and you have to understand the peril you're in. People don't understand, kids for sure, but even adults don't really understand their Miranda rights. We think we do. We can recite them by heart. But, like I often ask in public lectures, I often ask this question. Here's a question. Police bring in, they should read your Miranda rights. Do you understand what I've just read to you? You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. I understand. Are you willing to talk to me at this time? Yes. Okay. Please sign this waiver. And you put your signature and a date on the waiver.
Right.
Now, you've waived your rights and things start to get ugly. Can you reinvoke those rights? Now, I asked that question just earlier this week to a graduate school audience, and they stopped in their tracks and said, I don't know. Now, this is a group of highly educated people, and they're not stressed of interrogation, and they don't know that according to Miranda, you can reinvoke those rights at any time, even if you waive them at first.
It's your right.
It's your right.
It's a right.
So even educated adults don't fully understand what their rights are. If they're innocent, they'll invoke them anyway.
Yeah. Mind if I poke your head around in your car? Yes, I do. Do not do that. Because the thing you have to think about is this is Pete speaking as a spy. That person's lying to me. This person's lying. Oh, you're going to give me a deal? You better put it in writing. Because there is no deal. There's no deal. They're always lying until they say otherwise, because they want something from you. They want your freedom. And if you don't want to, and I'm talking about innocent people. We're not excusing bad behavior.
Right.
But yeah, you shouldn't trust these folks. If they take you into a back room to have a conversation, hey, guess what? If we're going back here, I want a lawyer. Oh, we're walking. You just want to talk to me? I'm going to cooperate. First, I'm going to get my lawyer, and they're going to allow us to work together. That's how I'm going to cooperate. I have this right, and don't feel bad about exercising it.
Right. Exactly. Well, I mean, you kind of nailed it. And talk about particularly vulnerable populations like kids, minors.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
If you would have asked me 20 years ago, what's the best way to protect a kid? Simple. The parent in me would say, you put the parent in the room. Nobody cares about the kid more than the parent.
Right.
Well, the research is in, and the research shows that parents, sometimes they're protective, and sometimes they're the opposite of protective.
Right.
When police bring a kid in and they claim, for example, we've got your footprints right there at the crime scene. We've just analyzed the shoe prints and those are yours. And the mother who's sitting in the room says, "What? You were there? Hey, you tell them what they want to hear so we can get out of here."
Oh boy. Yeah.
There are cases where parent ultimately serves as an agent of police, because when the police lie about the evidence, the parent believes the lie. And now they're outraged at what they're seeing as possible in their kids.
Right.
So the presence of a parent doesn't work. It's got to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And if you've got a shitty kid that isn't that shitty, you're gonna be like, oh, you're not a surprise. I'm I'm done being disappointed, right? Yeah, it's a great point. The whole invoking the rights and everything. So are the police? There are so many of these cases. How many of you does there need to be to deal with all of them? If you can take on 2 a year, that doesn't seem like that's nearly enough.
It's actually been, years ago when I kind of opened this field, I was kind of the person, but there wasn't that much coming at me. Now I get, I don't know, some hundreds of inquiries a year. And I post on my website a list of about 20 or 25 experts that I trust. I will often talk to the lawyers and say, okay, if this is an adolescent case or a case involving maybe someone with clinical mental health issues, I would refer them to a different expert accordingly. But I tend to refer all but 1 or 2 cases a year of the hundreds I get. What's coming at me is in some serious numbers. And I do talk to the lawyers, and often these are troubling cases from what I can tell. and I refer them to other experts. Now, thankfully, after many years, there are now a lot of experts I can trust.
Right.
But it's what makes these cases particularly hard. I look back over the Innocence Project database. When there's a false confession in evidence, 78% of those cases with false confessions also contain one or two or three other errors of evidence, usually forensic evidence. So by the time you get to court, there's a confession corroborated by a forensic analyst's interpretation of fingerprints or handwriting or arson materials. And that corroboration makes it hard for the jury to overcome the confession, even harder than it would be. It's common practice, for example, for detectives after they've taken a confession to spend the next day in the autopsy room with the forensic pathologist. Why? Why does the forensic pathologist, rendering what we all think is a medical judgment, need the presence of detectives who took a confession? And then we're supposed to, lo and behold, be surprised that they have independently confirmed the confession with medical evidence?
Right.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, I hate it. I hate it. This also, I'm assuming, impacts lower socioeconomic folks more than folks that have money.
Yes, and the legal, I mean, simply having access to lawyers and professionals. Yes, it's everybody's vulnerable, but yes,
Right.
I think if you have means, you are less likely to be identified as a suspect in the first place and hauled in. But it's I think we're all vulnerable, and again, that's why I talk about that in the workplace example, because anyone who says I would never confess to something I didn't do, think again. I think you would.
Yeah.
Two myths we need to break. One, I would not confess to a crime I didn't commit. Yes, you might. Two, I'd know a false confession if I saw one. No, you wouldn't. And I've got data showing you wouldn't. People can't tell the difference between true confessions and false confessions, and I've shown that, and others have too.
This is a bit of a more abstract question, but when we hear all these things, we want to do a better job, and we see like all this news about increased crime on the streets, and I don't know if that's hocus pocus because that stuff sells well, and they're like, "Hey, look at all these kids breaking into this store." When I was a kid, there was always a guy who would run into Gap and grab a stack of jeans. My buddy worked there. He's like, "Yeah, some guy came in, grabbed a stack of jeans, and ran out." So this has always gone on. Is it worse? I don't know. Is the perception of it being worse? Yeah, probably. But is it better to cast the net and get some innocent people to catch more guilty people, or is it better to default on the other side and say, "Hey, we're going to let some guilty people go because we want to put way fewer innocent people in prison"?
I have no use for allowing the guilty to go free, to escape arrest and prosecution. But my answer would be I wouldn't lean in either direction. I mean, that mistake of wrongfully convicting the innocent, that is clearly of the greatest magnitude type of error. But but again, it's not either or. The goal should be one of when we study false confessions in the laboratory, if we vary techniques, we bring people in, we induce some but not others to commit a crime, cheating or whatever. And then we look at the use of different tactics. Our goal is to produce diagnostic outcomes. Our goal is to find a technique that produces confessions from the guilty, but not from the innocent. A perfectly diagnostic, and that should be the goal. And the problem is that the interrogation techniques used in this country do not achieve that goal. They don't even seem to aspire to that goal. They don't seem sensitive enough to the fact that, you know what, we're bringing in too many innocent people through this process. The other thing as part of that is, and here's why I think it's a bit of a Hobson's choice. When I'm going to read to you from a criminology paper from 2 years ago. 109 true perpetrators, 102 of whom went on and committed additional crimes. Now, here's the thing. When the Innocence Project DNA exonerates somebody, often the DNA gets a hit in the national database to the actual offender. When they go back and look at those cases, in which the actual offender has been identified, that actual offender who escaped prosecution because they closed the case on an innocent person, the vast majority went on to commit one or more other violent offenses, sex crimes, murder. According to this paper, by extrapolation from our findings, we estimate that wrongful convictions that occur annually may lead to more than 41,000 additional crimes. I'm citing Robert Norris and colleagues, criminologists. So when you close a case on an innocent person, you're not thereby also making the streets safer. You're actually having two bad effects. Reducing false confessions is a win-win.
I'll quickly say one of the things too about DNA is we're learning that DNA is a lot less 100% than we want it to be. You know, there was a case out here in California where a girl was bludgeoned to death on a beach, and ultimately they figured out that it was a medical examiner who lived nowhere near her who was guilty of this. Maybe you know this story, I don't know. And the reason why they found that out was her semen was found, you know, on her body in some way, some form. The problem is that medical examiners often use their own semen as a control. And so it was a cross-contamination case. Wow. He didn't do it, ultimately committed suicide because his life had been destroyed. Oh, gosh. And so even with like DNA, you're like, okay, I mean, I know the DNA is great. There's another case out here where they got a guy who apparently massacred a whole family, and there's like one little drip of his blood in the entire house. And they go to get the vial, and there's like a needle prick in the rubber stop. And you're like, for me, like, that's it, done, game over. You, whether he did it or not, your evidence is tainted. You can't have a contaminated blood. It's like, it's so crazy. Oh my God! The last thing I want to,
you should be in a forensics program.
Seriously, I want to help with these things. It is crazy. The last thing I want to ask is, how often does the state employ you to say, hey, are we getting this right?
More frequently now than ever before. I just worked in a case, for example, in New York, involving what have turned out to be 3 exonerations that were announced this past summer. And I went back over the case files. It's an old case from the 1990s. And oh my God, after I looked at the case files, I saw that the confessions contain no evidence of guilty knowledge. There was no corroborating physical evidence. The ways in which the confessions were taken were off. It involved a detective who's been involved in well over 20 wrongful convictions. They brought in, I mean, it was just everything that could be wrong. And I just said, so they've exonerated those 3 men. So more and more now I'm getting involved at that level, and that's good. That's right. A lot of prosecutors' offices now have conviction integrity units in which they go back and review some of their own more troubling convictions. And that's a terrific development. It's hard on those who work in those offices because they're working within a prosecutor's office where some of those who still are there worked on that case.
Yeah. And they're the enemy, right? Yeah.
And they're the enemy within the same office. So, but it's an important development. And I will almost never say no to that offer. You know, would you help us on this review?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good to hear that we're seeing some turn in the tide. And thanks for carrying this flag for us for 40 years and trying to get us better at this stuff. It's shocking. And that's why when I saw that show, I don't know if it was a 2020 episode or something you were talking on, and I was like, I've got to get more into this because it's just, these are preventable tragedies, where by just being less confident in our own perfection, we can be a little bit better at this.
And so counterintuitive. I just remember my own naivety the first time I encountered this situation.
Yeah. And when you pick up a file and you start going through it, is it pretty obvious to you right away, like, hey, I smell a problem?
You know, what's crazy is when a lawyer starts telling me the story, I stop them usually in mid-sentence and I say, so let me tell you the rest. And they're dumbfounded because I've seen this show before. This feels like a rerun of something I've seen. I used to ask the question, well, did he know things in the confession that he couldn't have known? And they would say, yes, he seemed to know facts that were not in the newspapers. And I used to naively think, oh, well, then that's a credible confession. Or I would ask, is there any other evidence that corroborates? And when they'd say, well, yeah, there's a witness, and I would naively, yeah, I know. And then I learned I actually politely declined a couple of cases, and those gentlemen were convicted and later exonerated. So I learned the hard way, like anybody else.
Sure.
I started out believing in confessions more than I should have.
Our faith in handwriting analysis, in eyewitness testimony, I mean, gosh, it's just over and over again. These things are proven to be way too problematic.
Yes.
You know, like I recognize the voice from 20 years ago. No, you don't. Like, no, you don't. Sorry, you don't.
I know I couldn't.
But I'm sure of it, you know? Yeah. Well, listen, man, I don't want to take any more of your time. I appreciate it. I'd love to have you come back on. It's just such a fascinating topic, and it's heartbreaking at the same time. And the more we can start to understand this, the better we can get. All we're asking is let's be better at not putting innocent people in jail, right? And like that's what we're asking for.
And reopen those cases and find the person who did it.
Exactly. All right. Let me roll the credits here. Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by